This is Disaster and After, how we face the worst and build what's next.
He had that 1,000-yard stare, and he grabbed me by the shoulders, and he said, "Brian, they're just like us. They're just like us."
Disaster confronts us with the sudden, the violent, the unpredictable. It reveals the limits of our systems and our own fragility. After the storm comes a choice. This is our second conversation with retired Admiral Brian Flynn, a pioneer in the world of disaster mental health. Thank you for being here. We talked earlier about Hurricane Andrew and how that was in some ways, one of the hardest disasters, most personally impactful for you in a negative way. But you've said that Oklahoma City was kind of the most powerful disaster you ever worked on. And what does that mean to you and what made it so?
Well, for me, what made me characterize it as the most powerful is the blend of negativity and positive experiences. It was horrific, and we can talk about that as we go on through this segment. But it was also an amazingly wonderful experience. I've never seen before or since the kind of community support and working together among agencies that I saw there. Everybody worked together and helped. Organizational boundaries were broken down. If there was a problem, it got solved, and it got solved quickly, eagerly. The politics were lined up. Governor Keating, when there was shift changes at the building site, the Murrah building, he greeted each shift after they came out personally. So there was political support going on. The community support was just amazing. Those of us who either wore uniforms or had badges that identified us with the effort, you couldn't buy a meal there. You couldn't pay for dry cleaning. Everybody was thanking us when we were there. Just prior to the explosion, the Oklahoma Restaurant Association was getting ready to have their annual meeting in Oklahoma City. That obviously didn't happen, but they were there with food over a period of weeks. They served, like 20,000 meals for people. There was a place to go to eat, to rest. There were tables filled with drawings that children had done, thanking the rescuers and those of us who were working. It was just an amazing kind of situation that I had never seen before. Again, going back to our last segment, I compare that with Andrew. The populace in Miami was not, by and large, supportive of FEMA and the efforts. On my last day there, I had a rental car that I used. I had a FEMA placard in the window that said Federal Emergency Response Vehicle. My last night there, I forgot to take it out of the car. And when I got up the next morning ready to go catch my plane, all 4 tires had been slashed. And I just left the car. Called the rental car company, said, "Come pick it up, I'm leaving." So the difference, the contrast was striking.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I think, sometimes if you're working in disaster response, especially if you have the word federal in front of your name in some way, it can bring out, all kinds of responses. And I certainly resonate with that in terms of the 2 disasters that seem like that to me were September 11th, where there was really some similar unity, and Hurricane Katrina, where it was just, the same kind of crisis and personal toll. So what do you remember most from your first hours on the ground?
My first memories were that this was different. This was the first disaster that I had ever been involved with. It was an intentional human-caused event, and that made it different. It was one of the few disasters where I didn't actually go to the site immediately. I didn't go there for several days. I was at the disaster field office working there and commuting back and forth to with the Department of Mental Health, but I didn't go to the site of the bombing. There's no reason for me. I didn't have any business there.
Our job, your job, was to help set up the grant that the state would use to do the outreach and the crisis counseling.
That's correct. So that was where I went. I went there. I had my meals where everybody else was having them at the convention center that was set up for that. So that was what told me it was different.
I'm just curious, how did the fact that the victims of this bombing were federal workers, and their children, the children of federal workers, how did that affect you and others at the scene? Were people conscious that, like the federal responders, that this has been federal workers that have been targeted?
Yes, they were, and probably the most poignant example of that was the day I first went on site at the disaster site. As I said, I didn't do that for several days. I waited until most of the efforts of body recovery were done. I didn't want to interfere or distract, and I also wanted to be able to talk to some people there about their stress, and I didn't want to interfere. So first of all, it was a very extensive security process you had to go through. It took hours to get cleared to get into the site. There was special badging, and I remember going in front of that building, and one of the first things that struck me was just the size of the destruction. This is a multi-story building that was basically had the whole side of it blown off. One of the images that I have that I hadn't expected was when you looked around, it looked like you were in the midst of a heavy frost on the ground, and it was glass. It was glass powder that was there. The breaking of windows in the Murrah building and all around was massive. And I remember standing in front of that building and looking in and becoming very conscious of my identification with the people who work there. The desks in there were the gray desks that all of us who work for the federal government saw. The same kind of cabinets that GSA provides. The same, all the office furniture was the same. And I thought, gee, this is like my office. And then shortly after I got there, somebody started walking toward me, had a hard hat on, and it turns out to be a FEMA guy that I knew from Washington, and he was in logistics for FEMA. He handled the organizational part of that, not the field stuff. So he's not somebody used to working in the field. And he came up to me, and he had that 1,000-yard stare, and he grabbed me by the shoulders, and he said, "Brian, they're just like us. They're just like us." And so, and then he started telling me about some of the things that he had seen, and I won't repeat here. They're just very gruesome, traumatic kinds of things that nobody should have to see. And he just kept saying, "They're just like us. They're just like us." And so he really drove home the fact that this was somebody I could identify with. These were workers who were like me. And the end of that story is he actually retired shortly after that. Because he said, "I just don't want to ever have to be called off to experience something like this again." And if it happens again because of his experience there, he would have been. So he retired because of that. It was a loss for FEMA. Good example of how it's tough when you have people who are deployed in highly provocative, traumatic situations who aren't used to that or trained or prepared for it. The other thing that just struck me there was, as you may remember, there were 168 people killed in that. 19 of those were children and infants. There's a daycare center there, and I walked around the corner, and here was a makeshift memorial to those children. And it was shoes. It's hard for me to talk about now. there were dolls, there were toys there, and I was overwhelmed emotionally by this sense of sadness and loss, but also rage. Right. I hadn't felt rage like this in my disaster response history. Right. I kept thinking to myself, somebody did this intentionally. Yeah. How could anybody do this? Yeah. And I'm a pretty emotional person, as you know. Anger and rage is not something I'm comfortable with.
Yeah, it's a whole different, a whole different set of emotions than you would experience of where a natural disaster.
And it was like it hit me in the back of the head. I wasn't expecting it, and I was just enraged, and so I knew that this was going to be very different for me. And then I did some interviews with the people there and had some wonderful and fascinating experiences there that I'm glad to tell you about. But that was when I realized that I was identifying heavily with what went on for the workers in that building.
I know personally I worked in Oklahoma City on a tornado and then came back and saw the site and came back years later. And I just remember going to the museum that was put there and seeing the pictures of the people, and they weren't people I knew, but they looked like people I knew. They looked like the people I worked with every day, just sort of salt of the earth federal workers.
I think for me also, it was the children. I had young children at the time, and these were people like me who went to work for their federal jobs, tried to take care of their kids when they had to work, and they were never going to come home again.
That seems like quite the mix of emotions. And did you kind of, if you were to take a step back, did that experience deepen your faith in people? You've talked about sort of the way the community came together, or did it make you more skeptical? Obviously, this was a human-caused and a ideologically driven act of mass violence, and did it deepen your faith in people, or did it leave you more, with kind of more skeptical about?
The former. It gave me hope. As you mentioned, I'd done a lot of disaster response, but I'd never seen this level of support and cooperation before. Tom Forrest is a sociologist who wrote an article years and years ago called Disaster Workers, the Transient Utopian Community. And it's an interesting way of thinking about this. Well, this was an example of that. People work together. I've never seen it before. And I saw particularly, with the community and people, hugging each other, thanking each other, being nice to each other, doing things for each other. I'd never experienced this. This was utopia in the midst of this carnage. And that's why I say it was the most positive, but it gave me hope. I knew, I'm not naive. I knew this wasn't going to last. Right. But I just wallowed in it for as long as I could, right. To know that this is a better world than we live in most of the time. And it's possible for us to live like this together, and I retain that hope, particularly now in very difficult times. I think about that all the time, and I remind myself there is a better way to live together, and it is possible to do that. So to directly respond to your question, it didn't make me more cynical. It made me more hopeful.
What would be any other stories about that?
Well, not so much on the site, but there were people that I hadn't worked with before, right. And not necessarily in those immediate days, but in the aftermath. I don't throw around the term hero very often, but one of my heroes from that is a woman who was on the prosecution team. One of the things that made this event different than others was it was a criminal act that caught the people, and there were trials that complicated the psychological recovery tremendously because the trials were years after that. And so people had very different expectations of what the criminal justice system was going to do for them and what they were going to be able to do and how that was going to help them. And the trial, the first trial was in Denver. So having to provide services and support to Oklahoma victims in Denver. It was moved there because of the feeling that they couldn't get a proper trial in Oklahoma City. But one of my heroes was a woman who was the liaison with the victims, and she took over 200 victim impact statements. I can't even imagine what it would be like to sit there and take these statements for over 200 people, and it took a toll on her. She became a casualty. Unfortunately, she was very sophisticated in terms of mental health. She was on the board of a local mental health center. It created problems in the workplace because some thought she was being over-identified with the victims rather than the prosecutors. And so she became a casualty, got services, and talks about that to this day. But it never even occurred to me when I went in there that people from the prosecution team would also be responders and be workers and would have the kinds of stresses that they had.
Yeah, I think we don't always think about the people who are absorbing the kind of vicarious trauma of these events, and sometimes even just people I know from some experience when people whose job is to chart the number of dead after an event and are keeping these records, but maybe impacting them in a way that people wouldn't even realize because they're absorbing the magnitude of sometimes what's happened.
I spent some considerable time when I was on site talking to people who worked on the site. And again, they were not people that I usually would be dealing with. And I remember one in particular when I went to interview the people that actually did the initial body handling after the remains were removed from the rubble. They worked in a basement unit in a building next door. And it's hard for me to imagine work that is more stressful than that. So I went to talk to them about what they were experiencing, particularly how they managed this kind of stress. And it was fascinating. Again, they weren't actively working when I was there. There were 2 remains that had not been recovered at that point. So they were waiting for that. But one of the fellows, I said, can you tell me a little bit about how you all manage your stress? And he said, come with me. And he took me over the side. And there was this cage hung up, and there were 2 doves in it. And he said, I raise doves when I'm not doing this. And he said, for me, they symbolize peace and hope and joy and salvation. And he said, we just had a ceremony where we released a number of doves. And he said, those 2 up there are waiting for these 2 bodies to be recovered. And he said, when we process those remains, I'll release the 2 of them. And that will be the end of it. And I thought, this was so creative, so idiosyncratic. And I couldn't, in my wildest imagination, have designed anything as a stress intervention without any advice or direction. And it created in me a passion for looking at the importance of symbols and rituals in understanding this. The written and spoken word fails us very quickly in highly emotional situations, and I have been fascinated with and consulted on and written on the importance of symbols and rituals after these events, but that was a very important event for me in seeing that. There were others that...
Yeah, no, that's a beautiful, beautiful example, and it's so interesting that someone could come up with just, tied it in such a beautiful way. What's interesting, too, is you said this was really an unprecedented disaster at the time. There hadn't been something like that in the U.S. And, I think when sometimes these kinds of approaches that somebody comes up with become these practices that others can emulate and can do on their own and follow on disasters. And I also found one of the things as a federal person, the best thing I could do half the time when I got into a new disaster was connect the people in the community to people from another community that had experienced something similar. Unfortunately, Oklahoma City was its own thing and still lives with us. I think the ripple effects of that have gone forever. And, when you talked about community members, there is this metaphor of the ripple effect. The fact that there are the people who are most directly impacted, and there are people throughout the community, especially something as horrific as Oklahoma City, where kind of the ripple goes throughout the whole community and people are being affected that, you wouldn't think they weren't on the site, but they were absorbing the pain.
Right.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that, Brian. And for the next segment, what we're going to be talking about is another really terrible crisis and disaster, which is the Columbine school shooting, and the work that you did after that. So thanks very much, and we'll stay tuned for the next one.
Thank you.